Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. Leading into the 1980s, Ronald Reagan became convinced of the growing threat of mutual assured destruction in the US's Cold War with the Soviet Union. Once in office, Reagan decided to take Soviet policy under his own control within the White House. What difference did the president's personal stewardship make to US policy making? Over his 8 years in power, he succeeded in persuading the USSR to reduce its nuclear arsenal, to end the Cold War, and ultimately allow the dismantling of the Soviet Union. Now, as present-day Taiwan faces an existential threat from an opponent even more powerful than the former USSR, Taiwan's new president is taking charge of 3 new committees, including one on defense. What lessons does the Reagan-era strategy provide? What results does President Lais want to achieve, and what messages is he sending by making this move? With us to discuss this are Chen Fang-yu, Soochow University Political Science Assistant Professor, and Guermantes Lailari, Institute for National Defense and Security Research, INDSR, visiting scholar. A very warm welcome to the show, both of you.
Thank you.
So we mentioned, and let me come to you, Professor Chen, first. We mentioned that Ronald Reagan decided to take, Soviet policy into the White House under his personal control, and now we know that Lai is taking this new defense committee as well as 2 others into the presidential office. So, what's the significance of Lai doing that now?
I think President Lais is trying to signal all the citizens that the priority of his government, and first is the defense committee, and also for the health, and also for the climate change. So this is the 3 priorities for the Lais administration. And also compared with President Tsai Ing-wen, Lais is showing a different style of leading. So he wants to lead by example and to show that everyone must put this as a priority. Yeah.
Guermantes, recently more than 100 devices of banned Huawei equipment, of course that's Chinese telecom, have been found at 3 Taiwan military bases. Can you tell us what sort of risk this poses to Taiwan, and whether this is a sort of issue that Lai has in mind by setting up a defense committee of this sort?
Absolutely. These devices, some of them like routers and controllers, can be remotely manipulated from anywhere in the world. And also the data from these devices can go anywhere in the world. And if they're Huawei, Huawei can design the router to push everything, all the data coming into it, into China, for example. So this is just one example of the cyber threat. The National Defense Authorization Act for this year told the Department of Defense,
that's the U.S.
U.S. correct, yeah, to work with Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense to work on its cyber defense. But what we're talking about is non-military. So the NDAA doesn't cover the civilian sector. So this is an area that Taiwan really needs to focus on. Its civil sector cyber arena is really poorly, in my opinion, poorly managed. You have basically the idea that, let's say each bank is responsible for its own security. There's nothing above the bank that will protect the bank. So each bank has to rely on one person or 2 people to make sure the bank is secure. And China has thousands of people who can try to get into the bank. So the whole cyber arena needs to be looked at as part of the defense of Taiwan.
Professor Chen, I mean, there's another example where recently Taiwan Coast Guard essentially allowed a Chinese vessel to sail very close to Taiwan, and indeed close to Taipei itself, and it was manned by an ex-PLA Navy captain. Some of the problems that Taiwan has is a sort of whole of society sort of attitude, in terms of realizing or recognizing any threat that there is to Taiwan.
I think Taiwan is under the threat of Chinese invasion for too long. So several decades, we have seen the China threat to Taiwan and all of the military threats. So the using of Huawei and other Chinese equipments are so common in Taiwan, very common. And people just don't know the threats from China. So I think overall we have to do more comprehensive measures to safeguard our security.
It seems remarkable, though, that Taiwanese would not know the threat from China and from Huawei when, the European, firstly in the US and then the European countries have essentially banned Huawei itself.
We actually banned it from our government. However, there's a lot of branches of the government. So in some branches, maybe in the local level, they are not aware of these laws, and also they are not aware of this ban for Huawei, and they just take the cheapest one. So every time when there's a contract, then they will pick up on the basis of the cost analysis and pick up the cheapest. And Chinese equipment is always the cheapest one. Yep.
Well, one of the things the government can do is test all these systems. They can increase the number of people that go out and test. For example, the cameras all around Taiwan. Are they made in China? Are there routers going to China? Is China watching what's going on in Taiwan for free?
And is this the sort of thing that the US actually has been doing in recent years?
Yes, I mean, part of the requirements is their testing, and they found, unfortunately, like in Taiwan, they found routers in the United States, and they are now removing them. So it's not perfect, but there has to be an attempt to manage the risk, and part of this is risk assessment. Where are the biggest threats? Is it in the financial sector? Is it in the power sector? And I think the government needs to step up and make rules a bit more strict and to test them. Not just make rules, but they have to go out and see, did you do what we told you to do?
So, Professor Chen, the first step is actually admitting that there are these flaws in the system, and then I guess, which is what President Lai wants to do, is just then set up structures to enable Taiwan to fix these problems.
Of course, that according to some lawmakers, they are keep sending some signals to the government that to check the equipment all over the island, and not only for the military but also for other government branches.
Guermantes, you.
A specific example is the government is trying to make sure that cameras in the car that are government owned are not made in China. The problem is that those only are referring to government cars. But for example, military personnel have their own private vehicles and they go onto base. But what about their cameras on their cars? So there has to be a comprehensive review in all sectors. The U.S. has an organization called CISA, Cybersecurity Information Security Agency, and what it does is it has 16 categories that looks at everything in the U.S. entire U.S. country, and looks at different critical parts of those infrastructures and tries to look at if they're vulnerable to attack and things that can be done to protect those systems.
In the Defense Committee, what do you think should be the priorities of that Defense Committee?
The committee itself should focus on the idea of defense as being bigger than the MND. It is everybody. Since World War I, wars have included the civilian population, unfortunately. And so the MND can no longer say, we've got this, you stay out of our business. No. When missiles come, they're going to be hitting not only MND sites, but they're going to be hitting places where people live.
As we know in the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah, and also in Israel, it would have been the same thing had Israel not had a missile defense system. Those missiles would have crashed into civilian populations. They were targeting civilians, so that has to stop. So the first thing is, besides expanding the definition of defense, I think the committee should focus on making the Taiwanese government and people more lethal. In other words, expand the roles and responsibilities of who can cause damage to the PLA or whoever shows up on the coast. The second thing is this whole issue of security. There has been so many leaks, so many people becoming spies, all this kind of stuff. That has to stop. It really is terrible. And two more things. right now, the ROC military's function is not to defend the people of Taiwan. It is to attack the PLA. So who's going to defend Taiwanese in their towns and villages when the PLA is coming in? So there has to be some kind of force, and maybe we'll talk about it later, where the people in those cities can protect themselves. And finally,
but
yeah.
what you said about the description of or the aim of what the ROC Army military does.
Yeah, it targets the PLA.
But they would also have to defend, right?
Well, their main focus is to attack, and defend their sites. But if they have to decide, do we protect a military base or a village? What are they going to do? And they only have one missile to protect. So what are they going to do? What's the operation? So they're going to probably protect their military base because the military base has more weapons that can be used against the PLA. So there's really no defense force that's going to protect the population or the industry of Taiwan.
Right. Okay.
And then finally, just the last thing is Taiwan's military has to work as a joint force. Right now, everything is separate, and everybody has their own kingdom, and they don't want to play together.
Right, okay, so working in silos.
Right.
Okay, now with a name like Whole of Society Defence Resilience Committee, a key focus of this committee is the establishment of a home guard for Taiwan. Taiwan's president has stressed the need to expand the training and applications of civilian forces. He said, only when all members of the society possess a strong will for self-defense and full confidence in themselves can they respond effectively to various disasters and risks. But when it comes to any possible China invasion, doubts have been raised over whether Taiwanese would actually fight, like the Ukrainians, to protect their country's sovereignty and future. Professor Chen, let me come to you first. Why are there such doubts? Are they founded or unfounded?
Well, there's always a lot of questions on whether our military is trained enough to protect ourselves, and also just as Guermantes mentions that it's not if there's a war, it's not only about the military but also for the whole society. However, all of the civil defense is now played or hosted by the civil groups. I think it's not correct. It should be a government and the civil groups cooperation to promote more civil defense education. So I think this committee is very important because it can have some top-down approach to promote more civil defense education, to teach people how to react, how to maintain a normal life, and how to protect ourselves during a war.
So along with proper management, as you say, under the government, maybe under the Ministry of Defense, like other civilian defense forces in other countries are there any other conditions for why there would be doubts as to why Taiwanese, normal civilians, may not want to fight? Professor Chen, for example, a split society, for example, the relationship with China.
Well, I think, first of all, in terms of the geographic conditions, there is a Taiwan Strait. So the Taiwan Strait plays as a buffer to the threat. So for a very long time, most of people, according to the public opinion, most of people do not think that the PLA will land it in Taiwan. So people just do not sense the urgency of training and to practice how to protect ourselves. People tend to think that maybe we can attack them, maybe we can stop them in the Taiwan Strait. However, there's a very high probability that we will face we have to do it in the street, in our cities. We have to practice, right? We have to prepare for the worst scenario. So it's very important for the civil defense education and training to have a whole society defense project. However, because nobody cares about that so far in the public opinion, so the government tend not to think too much about that.
Guermantes, if we can move now on to the criteria or conditions required for a successful civilian defense force, and if you can actually bring in the experience of other countries.
One of the challenges that Taiwan has is that it denies the civilian population from being armed. The other countries we're talking about, Ukraine, Israel, doesn't have those kinds of restrictions. It's not like the United States where any US citizen who's not a felon can get a gun. Rather, if you have a need for a gun in Ukraine or Israel, they can get a gun for their either personal defense or if they live in a dangerous area. One of the important things about lessons from these countries is that it's important to have a local security defense force that protects the village or can coordinate with the military or the police, and they train. And none of that kind of thing is happening in Taiwan. No one is allowed to have weapons. And so the only thing that's civil defense in Taiwan is rescue or learning about propaganda and disinformation and learning about the threat. But there's nothing that's kinetic that except the police or the military. That's it.
So could it actually grow out of those? So disaster response, local police, could this sort of be organized, be spread into divisions, which then become battalions?
It could be, but I think it's more of a challenge legally to do that, to go that route. I think what's more easier is that there are 800,000 reservists, and of those 800,000 reservists, 500,000 never get any kind of additional training. So exactly,
just like me.
So instead of trying to change the law and allow civilians to have weapons, all they have to do is increase the number of reservists that get trained, and increase the frequency, not one or twice in 8 or 10 years, but every year, like Israel, like Ukraine, like almost any country in the world that has reservists, everybody gets trained. And not just 1 week or 2 weeks, we're talking 30, 60, even 85 days in the case of Israel.
Trained by the Defense Ministry?
Yes.
Okay. Professor Chen, for you, what would be the difference between reservists, a civilian defense force, militia?
I think we have a lot of things to do, that's for sure, for the government, right? So the reservists, in the Tsai Ing-wen administration, there are some increase of the quality and change of the reservist training program. I think it's a good sign. I haven't been recruited yet, so I hope that more frequently that the reservists can get well trained for the emergencies. That is first. And secondly, for the civil society, the whole civil society, we should be trained for more than first aid and for more than the shelters and how to maintain a normal life. We should have to be trained for more in the military style training. So that is not only for the worst case scenario, but also to increase our self-defense determinants. So it's very important to work as a community. And also for the militia, that is a more controversial one, but that we have to discuss about that. For a lot of countries have this. So for example, Switzerland, they have this kind of quasi-militia, quasi-military program that is to recruit civilians to the military and for training. They don't have to stay in the military for 4 years, and they have to go back maybe for certain weeks per year, and they can be, when there's an emergency, they can do their jobs. So I think there's a good model for Taiwan. However, unfortunately, in the past few years, every time when we come up with these issues, then there's a lot of controversies, and then the government just do not want to talk about this anymore. So I hope that we can talk about this, discuss about this, and discuss whether or how we can build up such a defense force that can protect ourselves.
Okay. Guermantes, we started with Ronald Reagan and the Cold War and his Soviet policy. With that parallel, is it meaningful for Taiwan's situation right now? What's lacking in Taiwan at the moment to get it to that sort of level of understanding the threat and being able to react?
I think under the previous administration, under President Tsai Ing-wen, I think she and her administration played their cards too cautiously and was afraid to discuss this topic. However,
why would they be afraid to talk about this?
Because they're afraid of the flight of people's money and people from Taiwan, and I think
foreign direct investment as well.
Right, all these different things. But I think that they were too cautious, and President Lai has to move forward. Look, everyone says Taiwan, keep the status quo, don't do anything because you don't want to upset China. Right. But on the other side, China is running around being more aggressive. I mean, since Pelosi's visit, the midline doesn't exist. That's the halfway point. So, if you have 160 kilometers between Taiwan and China, and it's 80 kilometers in the middle, now today they are, 30 kilometers. They're halfway. Taiwan has lost 50% of its space to respond to an attack. So now it's basically 24 nautical miles around Taiwan. All the aircraft and all the ships, the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Air Force, they're all pushing Taiwan. The new law that was passed a few weeks ago that says anybody who's pro-independence can get the death penalty. This is all psychological warfare. It's decreasing the space for people to think and to maneuver. And it's called the anaconda strategy because it's constantly choking Taiwan, the people mentally and physically. And so something has to be done. And I think it's the government's responsibility to say to the people, look, we can't pretend the monster is, you can't see the monster, it's not there. It is there. And there has to be a mature way to discuss this topic without freaking out everybody. I don't think Tsai Ing-wen's policy was effective. I'm hoping that this defense committee and other people and other parts of the government will figure out a way to help explain to the people, this is a threat, we need to deal with it, we can't ignore it, and here's the plan.
Yeah, because then it can be calm as opposed to reactive and, as you say, sort of scaring people unnecessarily. Professor Chen, let's finally move on to legal changes that are required. So this is all part of what we're basically saying here is that Taiwan needs to take that big step. Essentially, I think what I understood G-Man saying is that we need to actually go on a war footing, essentially, rather than trying to say that that everything's fine, the status quo can continue.
Well, we must understand that Xi Jinping is going to pursue his fourth term, and this was going to be in 2027. So it's highly likely that we will face a threat very soon. So we have to get prepared. However, because of the divided government right now, especially there's some chaos in the legislature, so it might be very difficult to change some of the legal system or the laws needed for the military reforms. However, I still think that the Lai Ching-te administration has to do more to firstly persuade people that what is needed, what is he going to do, to elaborate very clearly to people. What Tsai Ing-wen administration didn't do well is about communication with people. There's no policy communication at all, especially in the military reforms. So I think that the Lai administration has to do more to tell people what to do and to lay out the plans. Especially, I think the committee is a good first step, but first step is not enough. He has to do more to tell people. And then there's a lot of room for him to do on the policy side. Maybe it's very difficult to change the law. However, it's still a lot of policies that is not required by changing a law.
Right, okay. Guermantes, explain to us, what normally should happen in terms of why would a law be necessary? You talked about, civilians holding arms.
Right.
So what else is there that normally should require law?
Okay, in addition to the ability to access weapons, you need a lot of people, you need a lot of training, you need a lot of testing, exercising, and you need a lot of government and civil society working together. For example, these exercises that are done every year, they don't include these civil defense groups that practice these different things all the time, on the weekends and stuff like that. They're not part of the party, so to speak. So everything has to get worked together. What is the role of every single person during a contingency, a threat? One of the things that Lai doesn't need. Also, he doesn't need to change the laws if we follow the path of using reservists. Reservists are allowed to have weapons, or at least get access to weapons. So there's a lot of things he can do that don't require the law to change. And my understanding is the KMT and the TPP are willing to talk about civil defense as long as they're not armed. But if we arm the reservists, that's not a conflict. So he can move funds within M&D or MOI to cover training costs. He doesn't need a law to change that. We saw that Tsai Ing-wen increase the time of 4 months to a year for conscription without a law change. So he can do the same thing. He can increase the amount of time that conscription happens from a year to something else, higher. He can also use his position to bully the Legislative UN, to embarrass them. And he can have the National Security Council, the MOI, M&D, and other ministries work together. He can force that. He's the chief executive officer of the country. So these are some of the things he can do without having to change the law. And he also can build up national resilience and resistance by talking about the threat and getting other ministers to talk about it and get other people to talk about it, and not to ignore it like a lot of people that you mentioned prefer not to talk about and prefer just to go on their business and do their daily routine.
Chen Fang-yu, Guermantes Lailari, thank you very much for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you next time.